Welcome everybody to this session. Since April of this year, the Australian Bahai Community has been celebrating 100 years since the arrival of Clara and Hyde Dunn in 1920. They arrived in Sydney on the 10th of April, 1920, intent on spreading the Bahai teachings across the continent. Now, by April of this year also, the potential worldwide impact of COVID-19 had become apparent, and small matters such as celebrating a centenary year were put aside as families and communities and entire countries engaged in strategies to minimize the impact of the pandemic. The cancellation of centenary events did have, however, one small, hopefully useful outcome, and that was this online series, the weekly series on Zoom, the Australian Centenary Celebration Sessions on Saturday evenings. So since the 30th of May until tonight, the 28th of November, the origins of the Bahai communities in every Australian state and territory and some notable advocates have been examined in historical detail by more than 60 presenters across 28 sessions. All of these sessions have been on YouTube and have collectively attracted over 4,500 views. Until this evening, all presenters and most of the audience have come from within the Bahai community. However, there are many Australians who cherish similar views and values and who spend their energies and talents on our shared objective of not only making the world a better place, but building the foundations of peace on a global scale. People who have collaborated with the Bahai community on various projects towards these ends. In considering this category of Australians, better place to share his thoughts on association with the Bahai community than our presenter tonight, Dr. Keith Suter, who I will now welcome and introduce in brief. Keith describes himself as a global, some 5 decades of academic achievement and publication and leadership across the fields of national affairs, the global order, peace, economics and religion surely garner for him status as one of Australia's foremost public intellectuals. On the way to becoming an economic and social commentator, a strategic planner, an author and a broadcaster, Keith reinforced his academic credentials with 3 PhDs. He's going to explain those in brief, so I won't go into detail of those 3 PhDs, and they're on his website. You can see his academic background. But in addition to that scholarly work, he teaches on the Sydney International Campus of Boston University. He's the Director of Studies at the Australian branch of the International Law Association. He's the New South Wales Chair of the International Commission of Jurists. You may have seen him on television or heard him on radio or seen him in print. He's the Managing Director of Global Directions, which is a think tank. As a broadcaster, he appears on Australian radio on average once a day, on TV Channel 7 Sunrise, and on Weekend Sunrise, he's the Foreign Affairs editor. He has a weekly podcast called Global Truths that you can subscribe to. He's been a member of the Club of Rome since 1993. He's been a consultant on social policy with the Wesley Mission for 17 years. In 2019, Dr. Suter was made a member of the Order of Australia for services to international affairs in the Uniting Church. As early as the 1980s, Dr. Suter wrote in defense of the human rights of the Baha'is in Iran. And through the 80s, he contributed numerous articles to the Baha'i publication Herald of the South. He then participated in a number of our conferences of the Australian Association for Baha'i Studies. Across several decades, he has spoken by invitation of Baha'i communities around the country, or he has worked with Baha'i members in various branches of the United Nations Association of Australia. And a number of participants who have joined this session have let me know that they remember meeting Keith at one or other of these events. For this combination of reasons, I invited Keith to join us tonight to share with us his recollections of engagement with the Australian Bahai across the last several decades. as well as any thoughts he might wish to share with us on how our community can best engage with Australian society in the coming decades. So with these opening comments, I welcome Dr. Keith Suter and hand over to you to take the screen, and we look forward to hearing from you this evening.
Good, thanks very much indeed. I've just got to go back to find my Baha'i talk now, which we seem to have lost. At collecting accessible files. So I do have all sorts of papers, but not too many to hand to look at all my connections with the Baha'i community. And so I've been relying on my memory and Google. And to make my life even more complicated, Telstra have let me down with broadband. And so I only have limited internet and email access. My link with the Bahais comes about through the link with the United Nations Association. The Baha'i community in Australia has been a big supporter of the United Nations Association of Australia. I was involved with the UN Association as the New South Wales president in 1978 until 1985. Then I became also the federal president for the standard 3 years. And then when I moved across to Perth to run the Trinity Peace Research Institute, I was the WA president, and I'm now what's called a life member of the UN Association. Indeed, I spoke recently at their annual general meeting. So I've been very heavily involved with the UN Association, and that was how I got to find out more about the Bahais. And in sort of stimulating my memory, I've been trying to remember the people that have been so helpful to the UN Association from the Baha'i community. And they've also, as I say, provided my introduction to the faith. I've listed down there a number of people, Judy and David Hassel, and of course, Graham is the son of Judy and David, Thelma Palmer, who was with the UN Association in New South Wales and was executive officer there for many years, now in retirement. Mac Hazelwood was a Baptist minister who worked for the UN Association in Tasmania. And then when he and his wife retired to Queensland, he then converted across to the Bahais, and so spent his last years in Queensland as an active Baha'i. Pim Truman down in Tasmania was involved particularly with some of the peace groups, so that's how I got to run across her. Graham Nicholson, I knew when he was in the Northern Territory as a senior lawyer, and I think he's now in Queensland. Fiona and Keith MacDonald are in Western Australia. Fiona, I think, is on the National Spiritual Assembly, or has been. And Keith MacDonald was a journalist with the West Australian. And Marjorie Titman, who I think has also been with the National Spiritual Assembly, has also, of course, been a very active person in WA. And Jeff Dibden, who was in South Australia. And then, and I know that John's on the line, John and Erica Davidson in Tasmania. Again, I've known them through my giving talks down in Tasmania. And then Venus Kalexi and Natalie Mabini. I think Natalie is on the line tonight, involved in New South Wales. There was also an interesting case of Colleen Dawes, who I knew in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. She was a lawyer there, and I was serving on a Foreign Affairs committee, and had no interest, as far as I could tell, in Baha'is. And then I suddenly found out that she had investigated the Baha'i faith, converted, becoming a Baha'i from being, I think, an agnostic, and then went off to serve in Haifa as a lawyer. So another remarkable story of Baha'i conversion. All the Baha'is I've ever met have been very pleasant people and brilliant networkers. They get to know people. So in terms of the activities in which I've been involved, Graham has already alluded to some of these. In the early 1980s, the first Baha'i religious service from the House of Worship was televised on ABC TV. This was in the days when ABC TV had much more of a commitment to religious programs, And Alan Gill, who was then running ABC TV Religion, arranged for a televised religious service, and I spoke at that. It was a really fantastic service. That was in the early 1980s. I've given many talks at Baha'i events. I'm looking at some of the comments in the chat, some of the people who remember listening to me at various events. So I've spoken at the Yarranable Baha'i School and also the Baha'i WA Peace Festivals in the late 1980s when I lived in Perth. And as Graham has pointed out, I've written articles in Herald of the South and also been involved with some of your books, including this one by John Davidson and Marjorie Tidman, Cooperative Peace Strategies, which came out almost 30 years ago, still well worth reading. And currently I'm involved with Natalie in a project at the University of Technology, Sydney, and an organization called First Draft, looking at how the media can better portray the news in a more positive light. So let me turn now to my interest in the Baha'i faith. So from my own religious background, I'm a Christian. I was originally in England an Anglican and Methodist, and then here in Australia, I'm a member of the Uniting Church, which is made up of the Methodist Church, Presbyterian and Congregational. So I've been involved with Uniting Church right back at its beginning in June 1977. I've also had a very long interest in social justice matters, especially in the international context. And therefore, my interest from a Christian perspective tended to overlap with the Baha'i interest in these same issues. However, there is a contrast as to how I look at the world compared with the Baha'is. Because a lot of people have said, well, why don't you become a Baha'i? Well, I'll set out the reason. Edward Hallett Carr, who was a founder of the modern discipline of international relations, wrote about the distinction between the idealist and the realist. So I'm in the next page, please, Graham. I'm in the realist camp. Baha'is tend to be idealists, which is amazing when you look at the history of the faith and all the persecutions that they have suffered in Iran and elsewhere, but they tend still to be idealists. So the contrast is that a person who's a realist looks at the facts, doesn't have any great optimism about the future of humankind. Fits in very well, I've got to say, with a Christian perspective, because we talk about the fallenness of humankind, etc. And so we tend to be the realists. Baha'is, by contrast, throughout their scripture, tend to be much more idealistic, with the belief that, in fact, the world can be made a lot better, even though the Baha'is have suffered a lot of persecution because of their faith. So that's the basic difference that I have. I enjoy going to Baha'i events and reading the Baha'i literature, which takes me on to the limitations about the point of view that I've got about realism. So realists are experts in explaining why improvements can't be made. We talk about human nature, personal ambitions, people unwilling to work for the common good, the fallenness of humankind, which is the standard Christian phrase. In other words, whatever humans try to do, they're going to make a mess of it. Now, being exposed to Baha'i idealism is a useful balancing corrective. In other words, you can easily end up getting very depressed if you're a realist, because you'll take the view that whatever you're going to try to do is going to fail, and therefore nothing is worth attempting. And this can be a bit of a weakness, and you see that to a certain extent with a lot of Christians. I get involved with Christians about, what are we going to do about the environment? A lot of Christians are saying, you don't do anything about the environment. Let's wait for the environment to be destroyed, because Jesus will return as the world collapses. Therefore, anything you do to improve the environment is delaying the return of the Savior. That is their mindset. I came across this earlier on when I was involved with the nuclear struggle, because I took the view that we had to try to reduce the number of nuclear weapons in the world. And yet you had other people, Christian point of view, saying, we're looking forward to World War III. That's when Jesus will come. Indeed, there was often speculation about the fact that it will occur in the year 1988. It shows how long I've been involved in this debate. The argument, by the way, was that you start the countdown towards World War III with the creation of the State of Israel, 1948. And then you have a number of warning signs where you add 40 years, one generation, and that gave you 1988. And so there are a lot of Christians saying we're looking forward to World War III because that's when Jesus will return. Now they're tending to forget nuclear weapons, and now they're on to climate change as God's passage to this new world, whereby we have destruction and Jesus will return. So that's your traditional Christian thinking. Baha'is, by contrast, provide for me a useful balancing corrective. For example, I can talk about a new world order without getting criticized by the nationalists. If you use that phrase, new world order, you'll find all sorts of Christian conservatives coming out of the woodwork to be critical of people. You've only got to Google my name and New World Order and just see some of the comments that have been written about me over the decades. So New World Order is seen as a conspiracy. It's the Illuminati. It's the global elite who want to try to take over the world. But when I'm with Baha'is, I can talk about the New World Order because we're all on the same page. We don't see the phrase New World Order as part of some weird conspiracy theory or from QAnon or whatever all this other stuff is supporting Donald Trump. So I have found my links then with the Baha'is as being very helpful because it provides a counterbalance. You can be too realistic in world affairs. You can end up with being too depressed, too pessimistic. And Baha'is give me that opportunity in their literature to be far more optimistic. And I might also add the point that we live in an era of destructive nihilism. So I'm moving off the Christian agenda now and more amongst the young intellectuals that I have to work with. So these are people who take the view that there is no pattern to history. It's just one damn thing after another, and then you die. And then once you're dead, there's nothing beyond death. It's a very destructive nihilistic approach to living. And I think contributes to the mental health of a lot of our young people. I see that. Many of the students that I encounter are on antidepressants of some sort. So there is this very nihilistic culture in our society, reflected also in a lot of the pop music, the heavy metal pop music, etc. And as I say, there's also postmodernism, the big trend amongst academics. So postmodernism means that you simply cannot make any general statements, which I've just done, made a general statement that you can't make general statements, that there is no pattern to history, history is meaningless, and you just live one day to the next. You try to beat your competitors, you don't work with others, you look out for number one, you make a virtue out of selfishness. And so that is this, I think, postmodernism, which is corrupting the intellectual life in the Western world. Now, for me, what is important is the Baha'is have an emphasis on progressive revelations and a teleological approach to history. In other words, they can see that history has a particular purpose and a sense of direction. So that's what I really welcome with the Baha'is. It's a very different viewpoint. Those of you who are only mixed with Baha'is have no idea what the bad state of play is outside of the Baha'i community, where you, particularly amongst the academics, where they are nihilistic, postmodern, and almost teaching a gospel of despair. And that's what I find so wonderful about the Baha'is. They are refreshing and they are inspiring because they're trying to focus on something positive. So let me conclude now with just making some general comments about the role of religion in world affairs. My third PhD, which was awarded a few years ago, looked at the technique of what is called scenario planning. So when you look at the future, there are three ways of thinking about the future. One is prediction. Most predictions are a waste of time. Who would have predicted the COVID crisis for this year? But some predictions certainly do play out very well, particularly the impact of Moore's law, the doubling power of computers. That prediction has certainly held up very well indeed. So prediction is one way. You look at trends on a graph. The second way of thinking about the future is having a vision of a better future and then working towards that vision. Clearly, the Baha'i faith comes into that category. They have a vision of an improved world. That's the second way of thinking about the future. Third way of thinking about the future is not what is being predicted, not what you'd necessarily like to see happen, but what could happen. What are the signs of changes that are there, which are taking place, but we're simply not noticing it? So scenario planning is a technique for encouraging people to expand their mental horizons and get to look at what could be happening in the rest of the world, or whatever the context is, your company or whatever. You can use scenario planning. If you go to my website, Church Futures, you can see a little more about the technique of scenario planning. I applied that technique to the future of the Uniting Church. Now, when I told people that I was looking at the future of the Uniting Church, the comment was, well, that's going to be a very short doctorate. Look at the collapse of the Uniting Church. All these church buildings that are being closed down. You've got empty buildings, very few people going to them. That is true. But on the other hand, if you were to consolidate all of the Uniting Church into one corporation and quoted it on the Australian Stock Exchange, it would be one of the largest companies in Australia. Why? Because of the delivery of welfare services. So the Uniting Church is the largest single provider of residential aged care. The Roman Catholic Church is the largest single employer in Australia, because the Catholics have got some hospitals and aged care and also a lot of schools. So we see this interesting situation that Christian religion in Australia, in terms of the weekly church services, yes, in decline. But at the same time, we see this dramatic increase in the delivery of welfare services as governments keep giving Christian churches money to provide services, be it aged care, childcare, labour market programs helping the unemployed, Lifeline. These are all important components of the church's work. And for me, doing the PhD was a reaffirmation of the Uniting Church's work within Australia. Okay, the congregations are in decline, but the rest of the work is continuing to expand and will get bigger. Obviously, as Australia gets older, there'll be more and more demand for residential aged care. And that's where the Uniting Church has one of its strong points. So the warning that I keep giving people is, do not judge the state of the Christian church by what you see in Australia or in the United Kingdom. All the religions are growing rapidly outside of what we now call the weird world. So Australia, New Zealand, UK, Western Europe, United States, Canada, and Japan, they are the weird world. Weird that they are Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Now, in the old days, we would have called that the first world, or we might just refer to them as Western. The weird phrase is now much more accurate to describe the community in which we live here in Australia or New Zealand. Now, that weird world is actually shrinking because people in the weird world are not having too many children. So we're looking now at the return of China to the global scene, and then the return of India to the global scene. 400 years ago, a third of global economic output was in China. So China is simply saying, we're going back now to where we were before we fell apart in the period of warlords and European colonization. And then behind those two big countries, there's the continent of Africa. By the end of this century, there'll be more people in Africa than in India and China combined. And of course, in these countries, particularly Africa, Latin America, we're seeing the expansion of religion. Tomorrow, Sunday, there'll be more people in the Methodist Church at worship in Ghana than they will be throughout the whole of the United States. And the Methodist Church at one point used to be the biggest church in the United States. So that's where the expansion of religion is going. And so when I come across Western academics, the weird academics, who say, oh, well, forget about religion, that's disappearing from the world. It's disappearing from the weird world, but it is still thriving in the rest of the world, the other 90% of the population. And one of the things that I like about the Baha'is is the way in which they will work with other faiths. Years ago, I was given a copy of this book called A Century of Light. And it has a very interesting section in it because it deals with Shogha Effendi, who on September the 10th, 1911, spoke at my uncle's church, the City Temple, in the City of London, as part of his European work. So it's really very interesting how very early on, you had the Baha'is willing to cooperate with other faiths and not being at all exclusive. So my 8th point there is simply to emphasize the role of religion in world affairs is important, it has been important, and it will continue to be important. Do not judge the state of the world's religions by what you see in Australia or New Zealand. In the wider world, religion is very important, and Baha'is are clearly sort of linked into those other developments. Another thing about the importance, I think, of the Baha'i community is the focus on global governance. I'd have to say that the Baha'is seem to be the only people who talk about global governance at the moment. The Baha'is of all the faiths have really pioneered the discussion on this topic. It is invisible, for example, within the Uniting Church. I single out the Uniting Church because I've been involved with it from the outset back in 1977. I could make other criticisms of the Catholics and the Anglicans, but I'm not so linked with those. But in the case of the Uniting Church, we do not discuss global governance. The Baha'is discuss global governance. And they put out great books on the subject, including this one by John Davidson and Marjorie Tidman. So the Baha'is are the ones of all the religious faiths that have kept going with the discussion of global governance. And whatever my viewpoint is that whatever your cause, it's a lost cause until we can get global governance to work. And all the time you keep coming back to this problem. The COVID this year has shown the importance of governments having to work together. If you withdraw from the World Health Organization, you're hurting your own effort. It's interesting that the outgoing president who talked about make America great again, I think would have been re-elected this month had it not been for the COVID crisis. And so here you have a virus that begins in China, which has destroyed his presidential career. You simply cannot live as an isolated island. And the Baha'i faith keeps on emphasizing that point of view. If Donald Trump had read more about the Baha'i writings, he perhaps might have taken a more internationalist viewpoint. And so one sees, therefore, the importance of global governance, of working together on all of these issues. And so global governance is a vital development, despite the rise of narrow nationalisms, the problems with honoring treaties, and the opposition to international cooperation. Remember, COVID helped destroy President Trump. He thought somehow America could remain immune from a virus in China. That's not how the world goes nowadays. We are all interdependent, and the Baha'is have been saying that for an awfully long time. And so, I emphasize this book by John Davidson and Marjorie Tidman. This book, published in 1992, still remains very relevant to our situation today. And then finally, just keeping an eye on the time, finally, the need for hope. The Baha'i emphasis on education, equality of women and men, unity in diversity, nonviolent change, oneness of humanity, creating a global civilization, they all remain vital for human survival. And the search for positive alternatives, such as how news gets reported in the media, I know is a current project we've got in Sydney, and I'm working with Natalie on that. So we need to be generating new ideas. You go back to my 3 points: prediction, preferred, the vision, and the possible. Now, as you move into the future, you've got to balance those 3 techniques. And the Baha'is are very good at coming up with alternative, creative visions, giving us new targets towards which we should work. And I think that this Baha'i optimism is particularly important given the prevailing views on climate destruction. I mix a lot with children, and they're all very pessimistic. They're listening to Greta Thunberg and the failure of the climate change negotiations. You've got the Extinction Rebellion. I'm not directly involved with that, but I do liaise with someone who's involved with the Extinction Rebellion. And they basically are saying, or some of them, like Paul Kingsnorth, are saying basically, it's all finished. It's over for us. There's nothing we can do. So Paul Kingsnorth, one of the founders of the Dark Mountain Project, has simply now bought some land on the west coast of the Republic of Ireland, where he and his family are living as an alternative society. They want to live through this current crisis and hope to come out on the other side. But they've said, look, it's pointless trying to continue to work in the environment movement, which is where Paul Kingsnorth was certainly involved. Baha'is would say, no, you remain engaged with all of these challenges. And yet another issue I'm coming across now is the whole issue of information technology and the, if you like, the techno collapse, sometimes called the Year of Singularity. The Year of Singularity goes back to what I was saying earlier about prediction. So a lot of predictions don't work out, but one has. Gordon Moore, a founder of Intel, over half a century ago, predicted that the power of computers will double every 18 months to 2 years and would halve in price every 18 months to 2 years. So computers are becoming more powerful and they're becoming cheaper. There's a new movie going around called AlphaGo, which you can see for free on YouTube. So the world leading chess champion is a computer developed by IBM. The assumption was that Go is going to be a much more complicated game for computers to operate, because apparently there are more potential moves in a game of Go than there are atoms in the universe. And yet Google, through its alpha, has now developed a computer that is now beating the world's best person at the game of Go. So you've got a lot of speculation now about this increasing power of Moore's law, moving towards the Year of Singularity, whereby you have just this vertical line, basically, of knowledge. So around, people say, well, will computers ever become as intelligent as humans? And I say, yes, but not for long, because they will go away and double again. What are the computers going to do with human beings? Will they keep us on as pets? Will they decide that they need to have somebody to sweep the floors? What's going to be the future? These are all the big issues about the speculation of the redundancy of human beings. And so the Baha'i faith, with its focus on the need to search for positive alternatives, I think is a useful corrective to all of this pessimism. In short, the Baha'is keep on keeping on. They've endured all sorts of punishment over the years, the persecution, etc. And yet they keep on keeping on. They provide a good inspiration to the rest of us that it's possible to work for a better world. I'll leave it at that point, Graham, but I'll be open to questions.
Thank you very much. I will unshare the screen just in a moment, but also make sure that all of these comments are shared with everybody online. So you will get a chance to see those websites in the email that you get after the session. So I've stopped the share, and Keith has invited questions and dialogue with us. And I think it might be good if you chat your question and he can see the question and he can choose which ones to answer and how. Is that going to be okay for everybody? So just go to your chat box, and if you do have a question for Keith, you can chat it there. While people are thinking what to ask you, Keith, can I just throw in one question there about the progress of the Baha'i community in Australia? It's been quite slow and steady, 100 years. You've seen it over 3 or 4 decades. What's happening with religion? You've talked about the uniting church, but you know, if the Baha'is have such a powerful, positive message, actually the Baha'is would hope for much more response in this society than it's getting. What's your perception about the way that people are seeing progressive religions such as the Baha'i faith in the Australian context?
I think the problem in Australia is that we're a very secular society. And so people are just falling away from religion generally. Now, I can't comment on the state of the Baha'is, but generally, you know, in the Christian tradition, the people are just not interested in this. It's a remarkable collapse of an entire way of looking at the world, which has taken place in the last 30 odd years. And people, I come across youngsters who don't go to any religious activity. They may well be spiritual, but not religious. In other words, there is what's called therapeutic moralistic deism. In other words, they are deists in the sense that they accept, yes, there is a God out there. So that's your Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin God. There is a God, but he is not involved in today's affairs. He's out creating other worlds in the rest of the universe. That's your deist point of view. It's therapeutic in the sense that it's all designed to make you feel better, and particularly if you can become richer. And it's moralistic because it might contain a few moralistic guidelines. There's no attempt, I think, at getting at some of the deeper spiritual issues in our society. That's as I find in the Christian tradition. I'm not an expert on the problems that the Baha'is are encountering. The mere fact you're still hanging in there for 100 years would show that there is certainly something in the Baha'i religion which shows resilience. But as I say, it's a very difficult wicket on which to play in Australia or New Zealand.
Thank you, Keith. We do have some questions in the chat box, and first is from Keith McDonald. Keith, do you want to unmute and ask your question, and then I'll go to Andrew.
Yeah, hi Keith. It's been a few years since we spoke.
Yes, good day.
Hi, my question was simply that given what we're up against in the Western world and in countries like Australia, you described the difficulties. Have you got any advice as to how the Baha'is can better get through to people and improve that situation?
It's very difficult to communicate. Communication will only work if the people are willing to listen. Now, one of the arguments is that as society continues to collapse, then you may have a more willing audience. People will start to ask questions. But T.S. Eliot, the Anglo-American poet, said humanity can only bear a little realism. In other words, people will just continue to go along as happy little consumers and not really worry about these other issues. It's very difficult to communicate on these other topics. One of the things you could think about doing is really some sort of scenario planning exercise, looking at how the faith could evolve in Australia. Now, that's very challenging because you come up against people who really don't want to be challenged. Maybe not some, I don't know about the Baha'i faith. I don't know about the inner workings. But certainly in the Uniting Church, when I looked at the options, the 4 scenarios that I provided for the Uniting Church on how things could go, certainly there's been a lot of criticism. People just did not want to be confronted with the facts. They just want to stay as they are, talking amongst themselves. They don't want to expand out. Now, the Baha'is are going to have to perhaps work out how they can communicate better with the general public. And I can tell you, somebody who works in the media, it's very hard to do so. It may well be you spend more time in the social media space rather than in the conventional media. So I'm sorry I can't offer you a silver bullet there, Keith. It's just not going to work out that easily, I'm afraid.
Right. Well, thanks to Keith Suter for that question from Keith Donald. We won't cover all of the questions in sufficient detail, but we will highlight some of the issues that are being discussed. There are some communications specialists online with us, and there are members of our National Assembly who might talk to us about whether the type of scenario planning. Keith, I'm not yet taking on the challenge of your characterization of the Baha'i community as idealists, but that might come up a little later. Sometimes we see ourselves as optimistic pragmatists, but we'll get to that. Now, we do have a specialist in technology. Andrew Straneri has a question for you.
Thanks, Graham. Thanks, Keith, for your great insight. So you spoke about the technological revolution, and it's certainly dramatic. But I was interested in what role you thought it played towards advancing global governance. Is it irrelevant, or is it actually contributing towards global governance?
I think it has both positive and negative effects. The negative effects, brought out very well in the documentary called Social Dilemma, looks at how the society is being fragmented. So you get some people who only get their news from Facebook, or some who only get it from some other source. So we're actually losing a sense of global consciousness because people are all in their own little silos. And so a lot of current media actually puts people into different groups and they don't necessarily communicate with each other. At the same time, technology is a unifying force. When you look at the breakthroughs that have occurred with, say, with railways, canals, aeroplanes, those technologies have brought the world together. So I don't think you can say it's one thing or the other. I think it's a mixture of both. And you need to look at each one on its merits.
Andrew, sufficient for you for now?
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Presumably the Baha'is are looking at the impact of modern technology on their faith. Is that part of the work of the National Spiritual Assembly, or?
Well, look, I can say that's a global question that's being looked at, Keith. I don't know who's online who can answer that. Natalie may have something to be able to say about that, but certainly that is taken into consideration at global level by the Baha'i Institute. And I don't know if anybody wants to talk about that one at the moment, or we just work our way down through the questions. And
can I just?
Ahmed, is it on that topic? All right, we'll just wait. I'm going to get your question later.
Can I say something on the same topic, please?
Sorry, who is speaking? Sorry, who is speaking?
Ahmad.
Much in the face of public. I wonder why it is the 100 years anniversary of Baha'i faith and not once it says in the TV or radio. It is when they are talking a lot about Yazidis, they talk about, I don't know, many other nominations, and they bring all the Muslims festivals and Indian festival. Why can't we kind of open the way and be in front over there at least, or in newspaper?
Well, for me, religion answers 3 questions. Where did I come from? What am I doing here? And where am I going next? That for me is the role of religion. And so religions provide different answers to those three questions. But they are the three basic questions that you would look for any religion to provide.
Thank you. Now, Alex, did you want to ask anything else about that answer? The three basic questions that Dr. Suter bases his conceptualization on.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Suter. Yes, and that's a good and covering definition. Thank you. And further, I might ask, what can we do with that concept as we conceptualize it? Simple. It allows us to get a vision of the past, of the present, and of the future. I agree very much with you. Can you elaborate? Thank you.
I think that there's a lot of confusion out there in the community because we no longer talk about religion. At least, well, Norway's part of the weird world as well. So you're in our camp, right? So in the weird world, we don't talk about religion, except perhaps to criticize what goes on in the Middle East. And so you've got people who are living really in a vacuum. And I think that, as I've said, that helps to explain, I think, some of the depression that you see with youngsters who don't know what the future holds for them. I guess the question would be is how evangelistic is the Baha'i faith? So from a Methodist point of view, or Uniting Church, we are instructed in how to go out and tell people about what we stand for. Now, a lot of our people are reluctant to do so, particularly in a secular society like Australia. But are the Bahais themselves getting instructions about how do you spread the good news of the Baha'i faith?
Good.
What do you do in Norway, Alex? Are you out there converting people?
I'm converting myself first and then trying to, I just pray. That's what I do mostly. But because as you say, it's not a subject per se, religion, and yeah, I'll ask you to what you might do. Yeah, thank you.
Well, what I do is that I meet with people over a coffee. As a Methodist, I don't drink alcohol, but I meet people over a coffee and we get chatting about what they're doing with their work and their life. And that gives me the opportunity to then bring in religion. So you don't want to go there, the old days of doing religion, standing on a street corner with your Bible, etc. Those days have gone. But now you've got to look at alternative ways of conducting evangelism and perhaps inviting your friends to come along to Baha'i church services to make sure the church services are warm and friendly. So as somebody comes in, they do get acknowledged, they get a badge to wear or something like that with their name on it. All this sort of stuff are basic issues which you should develop if you've got a service culture, right? You just speak to somebody who runs a hotel. They will tell you some of the things you could do. You've got to be more innovative. But it may well be that I don't know about this, perhaps with the Baha'i faith, your view is that you don't go out there and evangelize. You just sit back and let people come to you or not. I don't know. But in the Uniting Church, we try to be a little more proactive and get out there.
Sounds good. Thank you very much.
This is a great conversation for us because we do have responses to some of that dialogue, but we know they're large subjects. We won't go into the great detail of it right now because we have more questions lined up. I'm going to ask Arvid, if you want to come online and ask your question.
Keith, my name's Ovid. From about 85 to 90, Judy Hassel would always introduce us at the Baha'i House of Worship, and it was about 35 years ago. We were both slightly younger men, but I've come back 35 years again to ask you more questions, Keith. Keith, there seems to be a challenge of an economic debate with nationalist versus globalist.
Yep.
and it seems primarily to do with economic sanctions and the way governance works around the progress of the economy. Do you see the either debate having an impact on global governance?
It should do, but people don't want to use the phrase global governance. I think there is a problem with the word governance. You know, when people think of governance, they think of politicians, and they therefore think a global version of Canberra would be a disaster, or a global version of Wellington, or a global version of Washington, DC, or Moscow, whatever. So that's why we no longer talk about world government, and we talk about governance, but we're still having difficulty communicating what that is all about. I actually encourage people to talk about the benefit of international cooperation without necessarily talking about governance. So in other words, you sell the sizzle, not the sausage, in marketing terms. You know, it's very difficult to sell a sausage as a sausage, but when you start to describe the aroma of that sizzle of the sausage, that's how you get people interested. And that's what we ought to be doing. We ought to be looking afresh at how we go about marketing the governance issues. Clearly, governments have got to work together. If everybody goes behind their tariff wars, we will end up with the same crisis of the 1930s, which led to World War II. And so we've got to focus on people gaining trade for mutual benefit. I'm so pleased to hear that you made the reference to Judy Hassel. One of the my introduction to the Bahais is that as president of the UN Association in New South Wales, I was to speak at a Baha'i event, and Judy and David were to drive me there because I don't drive. And when I arrived at their house near the University of New South Wales, they'd acquired a new dog, which bit a hole in my new trousers in my suit. So I went to the Baha'i event, and you might have been there for it if you're that far back, and there was a hole in the hem of the trousers, but all the Baha'is were very polite. Nobody commented on my having a hole in the trousers.
Oh,
I was there, but I didn't see the hole.
No, Keith, that dog did that to everybody. Now, Keith, there's a couple of questions about your views of global governance. I'll put them together. One is, one question came, do you think global governance will be achieved? The second question was, what is your view or picture of global governance? And the third is, what is your view of the future of the United Nations?
Yeah. Look, I've been involved with the UN issue since the middle of the 1960s. I learned how to do my public speaking at London's Hyde Park Corner, a member of the UN Association in the youth movement. So that's in the mid-1960s. And I was then much more convinced that we were going to make progress through the UN. There was still that generation who remembered World War I and the failure of the League of Nations. And so with this new entity, which it was new, 20 years old, the UN, there was a lot of interest in trying to make it work. I don't find that now. I think there's a whole new generation of people who've come through. For them, the UN has always existed. It's a bit like the Department of Education. It's always been there. No special excitement. And we are failing to remind people about the importance of international cooperation and the benefits that we gain from that. So what, in terms of a vision for global governance, no, I no longer have one. At one point, I was a great supporter of the UN, but if the UN is not being treated in the way that it was supposed to be treated by the member governments. Often when I speak at UN events, people say, well, the UN, for example, should have its own army. My view is, look, read the UN Charter. Many of the ideas that people now make are already contained in that 1945 document. And yet somehow we have fallen so far away from that. And we're now going back into this era of narrow nationalisms and a refusal to work together. And in a sense, Brexit is an example of that in the European Union context. So it is, from a gloomy point of view, it is very worrying indeed. I can't get much interest when I talk about global governance. People are just saying, well, look, we want to deal with other issues rather than the bigger picture of global governance. So I can't give you a vision of what I think should be done. There are a lot of articles and books out there on what could be done. I've written a few myself. But if you actually ask the practical steps, how do we move from where we are to this form of global governance? It's much more difficult to set out. And so from that point of view, I'm a little more pessimistic. I'm still hanging in there because otherwise, you just give up with despair. But I do recognize that it's a much more difficult situation in which we're now finding ourselves.
Great. That's a challenging answer that you've given, because probably people were expecting you to suggest a particular model that you're advocating or looking at, and you're saying no, at the moment you're not advocating anything in particular, and that also brings up other questions of, well, what's next for global order if people like Keith Suter can't think of anything? So thank you, Keith. That's really provocative answer that you've given. Now we're going to turn to some different topics and questions. Elizabeth, you want to come online and ask your question about your experience in rural Victoria?
Trying to get unmuted. Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Oh,
Go
good.
ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Graham. And thank you, Keith. I love the overview of what you're letting on to us tonight, because a lot of those things go over our head out here in normal land, and they're very interesting. Thank you. A lot to think about. My question was basically, twice I had tried to interact with local uniting churches when living in country towns, and I'm talking about 25-year differences. The first time was the International Women's Day, and knowing the women that I was in the town with asked if I could say a Baha'i prayer for women and declined because it wasn't a Christian prayer. And the second time was in 2019. I went to we had to go to a service and sing in the choir because I'm in a local choir. And it was an important day to me. And I said to the people that were coming that I would like to be able to at least say a prayer at the service, because it was the 200 years of the birth of the Bab. And I got declined again because it wasn't Christian. So I was just wondering, do they have a fear in the country towns about other religions and they don't want to share? Or it just seemed to me that it was a scary situation for them, that someone was going to say something different. And that was just the feelings I got from Keith. No, I don't know if you have anything to do with those things, but thank you.
No, I think, Elizabeth, the problem that you've got in the rural sector is that people are very conservative. I think you'd have more luck if you were in the big cities, and there are some parishes that would give you more latitude once you'd built up credibility with those particular parishes. I think part of the problem with the Bahais is that you don't have a system of ministers or priests or whatever. So normally within a community, you would have what's called a minister's fraternal. So the Anglican minister, the Catholics, the rabbis would all, and also, of course, Islamic, perhaps in some areas, would come together on a regular basis for this fraternal. Now, I'm not sure what Baha'is would do in that context. Is there a locally recognized spokesperson for the faith who could then make an application to join that fraternal? And perhaps at the very start, you've talked about the Uniting Church, someone who could go to the Uniting Church minister and say, are you meeting with other ministers? Am I able to join with that? In other words, just to break down this sense of otherness and give people the feeling that, yeah, you are a religion like everyone else. So
yes, I think, and now those very same churches are run by the women in town now.
Right.
I mean, the Uniting, the Church of Christ, the ministers rarely come, and the women in my women's groups I'm in are organising the services and running them, and they don't seem to have a unity connection, except that they know each other in the CWA or the choir or patchwork or something. So, and they're the ones that are organising it all.
And are you in the CWA?
Yes.
Ah, good. Well, at least you've got local credibility. That's
yes.
how it's done.
Yeah, that's what you do.
Build up the links.
Yes.
Because there'd be a lot of people saying, who the hell are Baha'is?
Yes.
Because you have such a low media profile, there'd be a lot of people who'd say, we just don't know what the Baha'is are about. And they would then feel threatened.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Elizabeth. So about familiarity and becoming comfortable with something new. Julian, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Graham and Keith. I'm coming from Africa, and right now I'm in Australia, where we call the weird country. And I'm listening to what Keith was saying about Africa. It's funny enough that, when I was young, there'll be a lot of churches going on Sundays, Fridays, and Saturdays. There'll be always churches and prayers and, name it. And I think I've never seen that kind of prayer in my life before when I came to Australia. So my question is, like, some people ask themselves, where's God? If, we praying every day, fasting overnight and during the day, and, just mentioning God every time. And we're still having all these challenges, all these diseases and, of course, corruption, and stuff like that. If our prayers are not going to God, why do we have to have religion and stuff like that? Some people ask this kind of question, but thank God that I'm a Baha'i, I can understand this. It's a process. But maybe just to Keith, for the people coming from down there, or for people who don't understand that God is there, why do we have all these challenges, and it's not a weird country or a weird continent?
Yeah. This is called Theodicy. In other words, why does evil exist in the world? Where is God at the moment? And there's a huge debate that goes on, and I'm not an expert in that field. One ray of hope for me in the African continent is the growth of Christianity. If you look at what the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain, the people who were very effective at driving that revolution in 1750 were the Quakers, who had a reputation for honesty, a country that was full of corruption. But the Quakers had this religious conviction that they had to be honest. And that's why you end up with the Cadburys and the Fries, etc., making chocolate, also running banks, etc. People trusted the Catholics. Now, is there a role for the Baha'is to get a reputation for being honest and straight dealing, and therefore perhaps starting a similar revolution in Africa?
Dr. Suter answers a question with a question. You see, it's a good technique, and this creates dialogue. It's a very good experience for us. There are three names in the list, and after that we might conclude soon if the questions dry up. I'm going to invite Ahmad and Graham and Bruce.
Sorry, Dr. Suter, you started your presentation about realism and optimism and being realistic, and Baha'is being idealist, and also about Baha'i persecution. My question is that if you compare the Baha'i society at 177 years after the declaration of the Bab with the Christians that were 200 years after the death of Christ, what would you compare those Christians in this concept of realism and idealistic individuals?
I talk about the three eras of Christianity in the last 2,000 years. So in the first 400 years, the Christians were a persecuted minority sect within the old Roman Empire. And they grew by personal example, the point I've just made to the previous person about honesty, etc. So in the first 400 years, they grew quickly, but through personal example and evangelism. And then after 400 years, Christianity captured the Roman Empire, or the Roman Empire captured Christianity. And so we then get many centuries of the Christians running the weird world. So that, for example, the date this year that we use comes from Christian calculations. the 2000 years, or now 2020 years, since the presumed birth of Jesus. So that's the second era. Again, I've explored this in my doctorate. So it is this dominant paradigm. Now we're moving into a third era in the weird world. That's Western Europe, North America, UK, Australia, New Zealand, whereby in this new era, the church is losing its institutional power and is having to reinvent itself. This is the challenge for the church, because quite often when you talk to old-fashioned church people in the weird world, they assume that they still maintain this institutional power. I think that era is on the way out. Therefore, we have to create new ways of outreach, which are based really on going back to where we were in the first 400 years, in the competition for ideas. And that's really where the Baha'is would be as well. That if you are interested in evangelism, you've got to go back to that first 400 years when you are competing for converts. So in terms of Christianity today, in the Western world, the weird world, it's in decline, but it is growing rapidly in Africa and Asia and Latin America. But they are reinventing the faith as they expand it. Now, one of the issues, I guess, within the Baha'i tradition, a lesson from this, is to what extent are people reinterpreting the Baha'i faith as you move along? You're still a young faith, 200 years. To what extent are there these theological discussions within your own faith?
But where the society after 200 years after the Christ, wouldn't the society would say, oh, these Christians are idealistic rather than realistic?
Yeah.
Well, this is the situation for Baha'is in this society now.
Exactly. You're seen as being idealistic, but also judged by your own way of working. Acts chapter 2, for example, talk about the early Christian communities, people sharing their possessions and people working together. This then provides it a vision of an alternative society, a Christian society. And so that's very idealistic, and it's one that worked for a while. And that may well be the challenge that Baha'is need to demonstrate to the rest of society, the points that I've already talked about, you know, the role of education, equality of women and men, etc. They need to be getting that out into the wider community and not just talking among themselves.
Thank you, Ahmed, for that. I'm going to now go to. We'll just leave that. We're going to leave that question there because of time, and we'll go on to the next. Graham, are you there?
It was about IT and telecommunication. I just wanted to say that the Guardian of the Faith in 1940s foresaw a smooth telecommunication system that will be established. And we are just seeing the beginning of that. And the Baha'is are using that communication system that is current now through their institutions to establish smooth communication between all parts of the faith, all parts of the world.
Yes. And this evening's meeting is a good example of the mobilization of technology.
Yes, thanks for reminding us of that, Ahmed. That's great. Graham, are you there? Did you want to make your comment?
Yes, Keith, I can understand the difficulty of deciding between realism and idealism, but you stress on your Christian teachings, and Christians are waiting for the nuclear war to bring about the return of Christ and the global crisis, return of Christ. And you say there's an increase in Christianity in Africa. But surely at some time you have to confront the return of Christ.
Yep, exactly. Now, my view about, again, I've written about this as well. My view is that you can't predict when Jesus is going to return. In the Olivet Discourse, which is in Matthew, Jesus says, no one knows the hour or the time. So my view is that Christian leaders are in the publicity department, not in the decision-making one. Therefore, we shouldn't be making these eccentric celestial timetables, as C.S. Lewis called them, for trying to work out when Jesus is going to return. We have to be ready at any time for Jesus to return, rather than trying to say, well, we'll have to wait for a nuclear war or whatever. Jesus could come back at any time or may not come back for another 1,000 years. We may have plenty more work to do on this earth before that second coming.
So I think Graham's alluding to the station of Baha'u'llah as Baha'is see him as the promised return. Keith, have you engaged with that aspect of the Baha'i teachings? Maybe that's part of the ongoing dialogue.
What you say is correct, Graham. I mean, as Baha'is, we believe that Jesus has returned. Now, Dr. Suter has read and studied Baha'i books and met many Baha'is. So I just wonder what his thoughts are on the claim by the Bab to be the return of Jesus.
As a Christian, I obviously don't accept that.
Okay, Graham, thank you for the question. And now, Keith, we have online someone from Honiara in the Solomon Islands.
Oh.
So Bruce Saunders. Bruce joins us for these. Got a question or comment to make. Welcome, Bruce.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yep.
we can.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, I got in a bit late to hear. I got the end of your speech, Keith, but what I would like to put forward is that I'm always say to people that you can go to every country of the world where every religion or non-religion exists, and yet people are able to respond to the message of the Baha'i faith of whatever background they are. There's a connection with them all. So this means to me that they're connected, they come from the one creator. So I think that there's a mysterious connection there. I think also, I often reflect on that the first message of the Morse code was sent on the eve of the declaration of the Bab in May 23rd, 1844. A Morse code message went in America 30 kilometers. And if it wasn't for that development of that technology, which has in the recent years exploded and has brought us together, has enabled a world to move forward in the way that Christ said when he came back, he'd bring us all into the one fold and the one shepherd, which we as Baha'is accept. Also, I just like to point out with COVID, I think it's demonstrated it has brought the world to its heels, as it were. We've lost all ability to fly and move and have freedom. It is events like this that will make mankind, who are so focused on their individual lifestyles and self-interest, that we have to change if we want to move forward. And COVID has brought about many changes in many ways we work and do things and consider things. In fact, doing what we're doing now is part of an outcome. So I just would feel that the world has moved forward, religions have come, people haven't embraced them. It took 300 years before Christianity had the Nicene Creed. It said, listen, guys, this is what it's all about. And I think that we are underestimating the power of our creator. And I'm not saying this I'm just saying I think we need to see a bigger picture. There's many people that are not seeing it, but time and events will change and bring a change. And I'd like to see what you feel about that, because to me, the proof is in the pudding.
Yep. Well, thanks very much, Bruce. And that's a good example of the idealist approach to world affairs. As a realist, I would have to say also that the development of modern technology has not necessarily led to any great improvement in other areas. Sure, we've invented the internet, but where do you make money on internet? Cat videos, pornography, and music. So Rupert Murdoch would say, I make money out of pandering to the baser instincts that humans have got. So the assumption you make, Bruce, is that everybody is as enlightened as you are. I'm just simply saying that there are a lot of people who are not nearly as enlightened, who are narrow, nationalistic, looking out for number one, and they're much more difficult to reach.
Yeah, that might, if I may add to that, I think that's true. I won't argue with that, but that world affairs will bring, if God is our creator, we all understand that, whatever faith created us, that inherent in the teachings of the Baha'i faith, we believe, is the changes that will come, and we have to move from out of the swamp, which we've got ourselves, and there's a vision for the future. And I feel that that's, and I see too, I live in the Solomons. I've been here for a long time, and you know, it's we say let words and let deeds be your, let not words be your adorning, but let deeds be your adorning. And this is the life of, this is what Baha'is demonstrate, and I think that has greater power. There's more and more of this come, because you're never going to clear the decks of the old. You've got to find a new way forward, and I think COVID and what's going to come from climate change, it's real, but we haven't accepted it. We haven't changed, and I think the Creator has, in His own way, provided means to go forward. I know it's used by different ones for their own advantage. That's because of the age in which we live, but we have to lift our eyes forward and see there is a way forward. And surely the turn of Christ said, the one fold of the one shepherd. Now, you can't have a one fold and one shepherd if you're all going to say Christ is the only one. So I feel you've got to look, there must be an understanding. That's all I want to share. And I'm sorry I missed your whole talk, but that's some comments I just wanted to put forward. Thank you.
Bruce. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. David Hassel, do you have your hand up there? You have to unmute and...
I unmute it. There it is. Unmuted now.
Oh, good day, David.
Hi, Keith. I must say, I'm sorry about what the dog did. On behalf of Judy, I'll apologise again.
As you have been doing for 40 years, yeah.
But I think I want to congratulate Keith on his presentation. I enjoyed it from start to finish, and you didn't have any criticism of us, really. And I was amazed how you found the positive aspect of everything we did and thought about. I really enjoyed that. And I thought it would be good for us to sort of think beyond what you said and how can we improve. But I did enjoy your presentation. I didn't believe you knew so much about us. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, David. Thank you. There is a handout that I've spoken to and which Graham will be sending out to everybody as well. All the notes that appeared on the screen will be sent out.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. Now, Keith, just one more question from me. You mentioned your uncle. Was it
at the City Temple in London?
In the City Temple. You mentioned that it was Shoghi Effendi. Actually, it was Abdul Baha.
Yes, I thought it was.
Yeah. But I'd love to just tell us a bit more before we finish, and then I'll ask Natalie to offer some words of thanks for your presentation. Who was your uncle in that situation? Keith, you there?
Sorry, Graham, you're breaking up.
Oh, I was. You mentioned that it was your uncle who was at the City Temple.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could just tell us briefly who he was.
Yep.
Because that would be of interest to us, and it was Abdul Baha who spoke there.
Yeah, so I came across this in this book called Century of Light, which was published by the Universal House of Justice, and I received it from the Bahai community of Balcombe Hills. So when I read it, I was very intrigued to see that Shoghi Effendi had spoken at the City Temple in London. Now, my late uncle, who died at the age of 100, was very involved in the City Temple as a message of encouragement to Elizabeth, who has problems with the Uniting Church down in Victoria. City Temple in London, which is Oliver Cromwell's old church, former congregational church, has always had an open pulpit and has allowed other people to speak. Now, my uncle was not in the congregation, of course, in 1911. He would have been very young at that time. But I was intrigued to see this reference. And if you can get hold of your book, and it's on page 20 and talks about the meeting in Europe.
Okay, well, thank you. But your uncle's name?
Oh, yeah, Reg Bayfield.
Okay.
He's not mentioned in the book, no.
There is considerable literature on Abdul Baha in England, including a very recent book brought out by Brill. I can give the details of that. So thank you so much. I'm going to invite Natalie Mobini, who's a member of our National Spiritual Assembly and also very involved in the Office of Public Information on behalf of the Australian Bahai Community. I've invited Natalie to give a word of thanks to Keith for this presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Graham, for giving me this opportunity. And yeah, it's a great honour and pleasure really to thank Keith for his presentation tonight. I think it gave us, those of us who have known him and enjoyed his presentations over many years, a reminder of the sharpness of his intellect and his remarkable skills of communication, and I might say his indefatigable energy. It was a presentation bringing with plenty of interesting ideas to explore. I think we have to say that Keith, you've clearly known quite a who's who of the Australian Bahai community, and you've had the good fortune to come across many of the most pleasant ones. And I know that you have evoked memories for many of us, including fond memories of some of those friends who have passed on. I think it's been really valuable for us to have someone like you who will hold up a mirror to show us our strengths, as David said, and what is distinctive about what we have to contribute to our society, as well as gently challenging us to think deeply about our beliefs and the way we go about speaking about them. And since I have the opportunity, I also did want to thank you more broadly for the friendship and support that you have given to our community over several decades. You've given very freely of your time on so many occasions. And I know that there are corporations these days who pay very handsomely for the kind of insights that you've been sharing with us tonight. More importantly, I think you've taken Baha'is as partners in thinking and action on big issues facing our world, albeit sometimes from different perspectives. We've benefited greatly from that exchange, and we hope that you have as well. I also just want to mention appreciation for two things that others may not have seen so much. And the first of those is the support that you have given over the decades to efforts to raise awareness about the persecution of Baha'is in Iran. Graham mentioned that briefly at the start, that you were writing about that as early as the 1980s. You've also done it through your involvement with the International Commission of Jurists. I think actually the last time I saw you in person may have been at the University of Notre Dame, where we were marking one of the anniversaries of the imprisonment of the 7 Baha'i leaders in Iran more recently. I mean, every support and mention has been really valuable to our efforts to keep that issue in the public eye. And the other thing I did just want to mention is that you've also given tremendous advice to those of us who have been involved in efforts to build relationships with media and other organisations. And that is something that still continues today in the project that you mentioned, which is being led by Venus Khaleesi. And we're always in that process very grateful for your candid assessments and advice. And you have always injected a healthy dose of realism, I think, to what we do. So we very much look forward to the relationship continuing. If we keep on keeping on, you certainly do as well. And so we look forward to an ongoing friendship for many years to come.
Thank you, Natalie. So just for us to give some thanks to Keith as we end the session for tonight. Thank you so much, Keith. It's been a very fascinating session.
Thank you.